Fred Chaney was awarded the Senior Australian of the Year award in 2014. As a founding co-chair of Reconciliation Australia and an early advocate for Aboriginal voting rights, Fred's contribution since 1961 includes helping establish the Aboriginal Legal Services for Western Australia. He was Federal Minister for Aboriginal Affairs 1978 till 1980, a Deputy President of the National Native Title Tribunal, chairing the board of Desert Knowledge Australia and the board of Central Desert Native Title Services. His address today will draw on his life's work in Aboriginal affairs, public administration, with emphasis on Aboriginal and other remote communities, reconciliation, and his desire to overcome the barriers that inhibit people's full economic and social participation in Australian society. He has a particular interest in how government often fails those who live and work in remote Australia. I now introduce you, Mr. Fred Chaney.
Well, thank you, Peter, for that introduction, and thank you to the organisers for this invitation, or the invitation to address the conference. Thank you, Patricia, for your welcome to country, and I will have much more to say about the significance of that and the importance of that to the rangelands, what the importance of what underlays that is to the rangelands in a few minutes. But the really critical thing is to have clarity of objective. If you want to achieve something, you have to know what you're trying to achieve. And so often we work at cross purposes, including across the rangelands. I do think this is fundamental, and I hope the point will come through in what I have to say this morning. And I would apply those same words to this conference. What do we want to get out of it? And when I look at the conference brochure, I see what we're told we're going to get out of it. I'm going to quote, "You'll engage with the question of how to live sustainably in the rangelands. You'll share your ideas and experience of how to nurture, then develop and share innovative solutions to the challenges of living successfully in our rangelands environments." Describes those environments. Climate extremes, remote urban decision-making and small isolated communities are common. What advances can we build on to ensure the social, cultural, economic and environmental well-being of people, businesses and communities who depend on our natural landscapes? Both the nature of the land and the people who live here have generated many imaginative and practical solutions to living in the rangelands. And this is the opportunity to hear about these solutions. And importantly, it finishes with the words, "and consider what else needs to be done." This is a very unusual gathering of people because most Australians, in fact, live on the coast. They hug the coast in the southeast and the southwest. Most live within 50 kilometres of the sea, and to be quite honest, the rangelands are out of sight and out of mind. Everyone here, however, has an interest in the 70% of the Australian continent, which is where less than 5% of the Australian people live. And what do I hope to get from this conference? Well, I hope that it will energise you. I hope that everybody will leave here because after demonstrating that good things are happening across the rangelands and that new ways of work are being found in pastoralism, environmental management, Indigenous communities and mining, that we can do better. All these things point the way to better social, economic, cultural and environmental outcomes. And I'm sure the conference wants the nation to be aware of the fact that the rangelands are important in all these ways and that there's good stuff out here which should be of national interest. I hope that we're all in the business of celebrating success because in my view, success is what energises you and enables you to keep going. Success is empowering. But at the same time, we're realists. We're not Pollyannas. And we should be realistic about the fact that along with the successes, there are social, economic, cultural and environmental problems across the outback. And dealing with these problems is exacerbated by the fact it's politically divided up by state and territory boundaries. The areas we're most concerned about are the often forgotten backyards of the capital cities where most Australians live and work. Adding to the complexity are the 3 tiers of government within each segment, often overlaid by Aboriginal land council structures, and it's not hard to understand how these overlaps impede getting effective action on important issues. That's particularly so if the 3 levels of government are all pulling in different directions and the Aboriginal people are pulling in another direction again. And so, hence my comments to the Minister last night. How do we get a sense of common purpose into all this? Across the rangelands, the residents, whether they're black, white or brindle, to use Gillian Carlishaw's phrase, whether engaged in mining, pastoralism, small business or Aboriginal communities, all make the same complaints about powerlessness in the face of distant governments, a lack of say in decisions which vitally affect their lives, a lack of accountability to them, they're all accountable back to head office, inadequate service provision and uncertain flows of government money. So in a vast region where uncertainty of climate and uncertainty of markets are a given, man-made, government-made uncertainties don't help. My hope for the conference is that individually you'll be encouraged by the interests of others in your work, energised by the story of others' achievements, and informed about the structural issues which need attention if the rangelands are to prosper. And I hope you'll leave here as champions of reform as well as excellence in your respective fields. I don't need to say anything about your particular interests and activities, which are reflected in the variety of your presentations. They're central to your working lives. But what each of you do by participating here is to help create a learning experience for all of us about best practice and problem solving. What I want to do is to remind you of the significance of structural issues and how structural change can produce new and better opportunities to achieve the conference aims. At the end of the conference, my friend and colleague Bruce Walker will challenge you all under the topic Radicalising the Rangelands, Disruptive Change or Progressive Policy. And it will be disappointing if you don't leave this conference determined to be part of achieving broad as well as particular change. I want to draw attention to, first, the extraordinary achievement of native peoples, obtaining recognition of their land rights and native title, which among other things assists new approaches to land management across large neglected areas. I want to draw attention to some of the important work flowing from that recognition of Indigenous rights and the roles including the opportunity for partnerships between environmentalists, Aboriginals, miners and philanthropists. I want to draw attention to the possibility of gains through opportunistic political intervention, exemplified by the Royalties for Regions program in Western Australia. I want to draw attention to the work of Desert Knowledge Australia, led by Bruce Walker in the Remote Focus project, which identifies the governance of governments as a critical failure point in remote Australia and what might be done about it. And finally, the work of the Empowered Communities Group, the 8 Aboriginal organisations, which, consistent with the views developed in Remote Focus, call for Aboriginal people having a real say in the decisions which affect their lives and which demand new structural approaches by government, making the Aboriginals prime actors in their own cause. If I turn to land rights and native title, in acknowledging, as we did, the Central Arrernte people on whose lands we meet, we're acknowledging one of the most recent positive innovations in the rangelands, an innovation which has great significance for the subject matter of the conference. Post-Mabo, which was 1992, Aboriginal people have legally recognised interests in land across much of the rangelands. The big change this has made is that Aboriginal people come to the table not as supplicants, but as stakeholders. Acknowledgement of country, like a welcome to country, is not a piece of political correctness. It reflects a shift in the legal position of Aboriginal people with respect to land. It's the most important shift since 1788. This shift has already encouraged and enabled a partial resurrection of the critical role Aboriginal people played in the shaping and management of the Australian landscape. That role was recently described brilliantly by Bill Gammage in his book, The Biggest Estate on Earth. And probably like everyone else in this room, I had this vague awareness of fire stick farming. Until I read that book, I had no idea of the sophistication of the land management practices used over thousands of years, and hence no idea how relevant the cessation of those practices has been to some of the environmental problems we face. Whatever your particular field of interest, for everyone seeking changes, there are lessons from the Indigenous struggles to get recognition of their land interests. The huge legal shift that Mabo represents is a reminder of the importance of academics and researchers, which might be a consolation for some of you today who may feel somewhat irrelevant. Indigenous determination was essential, but without the supportive work of historians and anthropologists, Mabo would not have happened. Mabo was initiated by a gardener. Those of you who are concerned with landscape might again find that consoling. That great shift was really initiated by a man who worked as a gardener at a university and an occasional lecturer. And it was his collaboration with academics which enabled the revolution. Lawyers, of course, played an important part, but so did the work of those who gave us a different understanding of our pre- and post-settlement history and of a very different Indigenous legal system. You can't read the Mabo judgments without understanding how important it was to the judicial reasoning that the judges had a new understanding of history. This is what underpinned a major change in Australian common law when an age of racial discrimination in the law was put behind us. It's a reminder that in unpredictable ways, your work, the work of you people here, will inform future changes and guide the innovations needed for the rangelands to prosper. Remote Australia doesn't have much electoral power. We have almost no electoral power. But what Mabo does is bring some power back to those who live in remote Australia. I raise the question, what else can be done to achieve that? How do we look after the environment of the vast rangelands properly? How do we ensure that it's a workable living environment for those who live here? Over the next few days, everyone here will contribute in some way to answering those questions. I turn now to the links to recognition, which is involved in caring for country. As understanding for the Indigenous estate has grown, Indigenous protected areas, IPAs, and caring for country programs have been established. If I can quote from the Pew Charitable Trust publication, The Modern Outback, and you'll be hearing from Pew, I think, in the next session, Aboriginal ranger groups working in Indigenous protected areas and parks on Aboriginal-owned lands manage more than 50 million hectares of the outback, an area more than twice the size of the state of Victoria. They use a combination of modern and traditional methods. The growth of IPAs over the past 10 years and the beneficial impact on the environment and local communities has been one of the success stories of the development of remote Australia, particularly for Aboriginal communities. Now, I'm personally familiar with some of this work in the Central Desert and East Pilbara. As the Director of Central Desert Native Title Services, I'm particularly proud of the work we do with native title holders to ensure that there are social, economic, environmental and cultural benefits flowing from native title. But our near neighbour, operating with the Madu native title holders in the East Pilbara, and I'm not going to even pretend to pronounce the words correctly, but they're commonly known as KJ, does this on a very large scale. KJ's activities with the Madu, that's in the East Pilbara, east of the pastoral regions, are built on the Commonwealth Ranger program, under which it employs 35 permanent staff and another 200 casually each year. This engages communities in activities that deliver environmental value while allowing people to fulfil cultural obligations and teach their young about the country. While the foundation for this work was Commonwealth funding, KJ's continued development and future sustainability will be reliant on diversified income streams that are not limited to government. Their income is now approximately 50% from non-government sources, thanks in large part to strategic relationships with the Nature Conservancy and BHP Billiton. These two organisations, one is the largest conservation NGO in the world, and the other, a leading global resources company, provide a range of capacity building programs, financial and in-kind support to KJ. They partner with the KJ on the Matu Living Deserts project. Now, this is innovation. This is an innovative corporate partnership for Indigenous land management in Australia, which contributes to significant conservation, social, cultural and economic benefits. The The project helps the Māori traditional owners to manage their country, which is one of the largest, most ecologically and culturally significant arid landscapes, by integrating their deep traditional knowledge of country with contemporary natural resource management practices. Now, key to this, and this is the bit that we find it so easy to overlook, key to this is supporting Mātu, that is the native people's own aspirations, which include balancing looking after country for its natural and cultural values, as well as harnessing economic opportunities. Now, we'll hear more in detail about that project in the Mātu Living Deserts project presentation on Thursday, and I think that will be a really one of the very splendid presentations at this conference. Despite the time that's passed since Mabo and the establishment of the Native Title Framework, quite honestly, a lot of scientists and a lot of governments still seem to struggle with the concept that Indigenous Australia needs to be on board with proposals and projects. They seem to miss the point that cultural values are one of the key motivators for traditional owners. So don't just tick box on an application form. You've got to have partnerships that enable and build capacity for Indigenous groups to manage their own country. Now, this is a very practical issue for the participants in this conference. There's an ever-decreasing amount of government funds available for projects, and while government agency may have legislative responsibility for threatened species, fire and weeds, etc., without financial resources, they're severely limited in what they can do. Partnering with traditional owners not only increases the potential to access other funds, for example, private partners, philanthropics and so on, but leverages their commitment, skills and knowledge to manage country in the longer term. Building capacity, guiding and supporting traditional practices with contemporary natural resource management is a smarter way to go. And the work that I've described by KJ and Central Desert Native Title Services are good examples of this. Historically, there was very little contemporary natural resource management done on country before those land management programs commenced. Now, that program's been independently assessed. If you believe in evidence-based policy, that matters. Social Ventures Australia completed an independent assessment of the KJ programs and measured the social return on investment. I don't want to unduly trespass on the presentation on Thursday, but the work that's been done has saved years of incarceration, reduced costs of alcohol-related crime and improved school attendance. And these things are part of a measured $55 million worth of benefits flowing from those programs as against $18 million of investment. So it's an impressive story. Now, no one, including me, will claim that these are the answer to all of what's needed on the rangelands, but they're a significant contribution which can be grown. There'll be opportunities for discussion about this later in the agenda, and my purpose now is to remind participants of some of the factors which made these innovations possible, because it's the factors that make the innovations possible that are relevant to each of you in your various areas. The factors are many and include, first of all, a new intellectual framework. This provided a different framework for action resulting from many influences, including things like the civil rights movement in the United States, the decolonisation movement in Africa, and so on. These things affected elite and public opinion and changed the way we thought about these things, including our own history in Australia. Another factor was the assertiveness of the native people themselves. The Northern Territory has a very honourable role in this, with the Yolngu having led the charge in Millipum's case in 1971, the Bark Petition, and so on. But they were willing to fight for their recognition, for the recognition of their rights. Fighting matters. There's a new understanding of our history, the importance of which is illustrated by the counterattack of those opposing a black armband view of our history. There's the role of champions, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, many of them unpaid, in dealing with the community, the courts, the governments and the parliaments. The great joy of much of my life, ladies and gentlemen, has been working with volunteers. All of the early work we did with Aboriginal people in the 70s was by volunteers. And there's no doubt that what you need in the community are champions for the things you think are important. And so I invite you to think of that as part of your own roles. There's the partnership between academics, lawyers and civil society agencies, including, importantly, churches, as well as the native people themselves, so partnerships really matter. And then there's the use of the media, civil society, the political system and the legal system as seems advantageous at any time. The really great thing about the struggle for land rights was the way it shifted from courts to politics, back to courts, into politics, to achieve, as I say, something of a revolution. Another lesson that we should draw from this, however, is the don't expect perfection from what you achieve. The solutions devised and implemented will not be perfect, and the imperfections of land rights and native title are often discussed and exposed. Every solution will be imperfect and has to be a learning experience. Every program needs to be part of a learning system. Achieving land rights since '76 and native title more recently has not been as successful as supporters would have wished at achieving social, economic and cultural gains. But caring for country is an area of progress and hope, restoring people as well as the environment. Can I then turn to politics? And in particular to my state of Western Australia and the Royalties for Regions program. This is the second successful innovation that I mentioned. This is a piece of political innovation. It addressed one of the standard justified complaints from remote Australia that all the money generated in the regions flows to the coast and the capital cities. In Western Australia, legislation and policy mandate that a specific amount of mineral royalties are to be set aside for expenditure in the regions. Now, how did that come about? Well, it came about through imaginative political leadership of a rare kind. This leadership came from Brendan Grills, who led the National Party in Western Australia. He took this entirely new policy to an election at a time when the fortunes of the National Party were at a low ebb. It worked. The party was successful in obtaining the balance of power in Western Australia, and it made a condition of going to coalition that the policy would be put in place. The policy is, of course, under continuous pressure. The DNA of all governments is directed at Treasury control of all funds. The Government of Western Australia is currently under severe financial pressure because of a combination of a huge drop in mining royalties and a large and costly public works program. The extraordinary thing is that such an innovative change ever occurred, but it did. It's an example of a major innovation put in place within an unusually short time frame through political leadership of a high order and a fortuitous electoral outcome. It's potentially fragile because the electoral numbers will not always guarantee a political lock-in. It's likely to have some long-term impact, however, with gradual erosion of the value of the financial subventions likely, rather than outright repeal. What's the lesson for those of us who work in the rangelands? What is the lesson for the people of remote Australia? The lesson to be drawn from this success is that regional voters should look carefully at how they exercise their minority status votes, with the aim of leveraging their votes and their representation as much as possible. This could have happened in the Northern Territory after the last election, when newly elected regional CLP members could have insisted on a more adequate provision for those parts of the Northern Territory beyond Darwin as a condition for their support. If I lived in regional Australia, in remote Australia, I would vote not on party lines but on those members who are prepared to make it a condition of their entry into Parliament that they would insist on a fair deal for the regions. I think the National Party of Western Australia has shown the way, and I wish I could see the same thing happen here in the Northern Territory. Can I turn now to a program known as Remote Focus, another example of innovative thinking, still a work in progress. In 2008, Desert Knowledge Australia, the statutory corporation I chaired, thanks to Claire Martin. I'm not sure I've ever forgiven you, Claire, but thank you very much for the privilege. And it's not to be confused with the CRC of the same name, brought together 28 people with very extensive experience of the outback. And we were to consider, and I quote, the looming crisis facing remote Australia, the apparent failure of Australian governments to adequately govern and engage with the country's vast arid and tropical regions. In the resulting prospectus that we issued, launching the development of a report on the governance of governments, it talked of impending calamity in remote Australia due to inability to provide basic services, lack of any real authority over decision-making, the drift the drift away of population, the stress on Indigenous culture and societal structures, and the risk of collapsing fragile ecosystems in the context of outmoded land management regimes. We ran this project over a period of years. It was run by Bruce, who you'll be hearing from on Thursday, and the project analysed the problem and concluded, among other things, these. Governance failures, the way governments themselves go about their business, are a threshold cause of policy failure. Policy for remote Australia needs to be separately conceived and framed and custom built to meet its specific circumstances and needs. And the challenge in designing new approaches to governing and administering remote Australia is that a paradigm shift in policy is required, one that addresses and changes structurally embedded habits, practices and approaches, and this can't come from within the present governance framework. What the report proposes, and the report was called Fixing the Hole in Australia's Heartland, is the establishment of governance models which ensure all levels of government and the community work together. What a fascinating and unique, innovative idea that governments would actually work together. And they should do that within a framework which has a shared vision for the region. Without a vision, as they say, the people perish. What are we actually trying to do out here? Do we have a shared vision? We need a framework which ensures that the role or mandate of each level of government is clear and is funded accordingly, and we need to have a capacity to settle disputes between the different levels of government and the community, because disputes will inevitably occur. And this is not what we have today. As the report notes, and I quote, "We know that more of the same will produce more of the same. Therefore, a changed approach to how government operates is needed. We accept that if the three levels of government and the community are working at cross purposes, success is impossible because goals are different." I interpolate here, I've been lucky enough to spend time with remote Aboriginal communities from time to time. My sense from the bottom up, looking from the point of view of those communities, is that government is incoherent, the goals of government change continuously, and the goals of state and federal government are often at cross purposes. How do we expect to prosper in those circumstances? To go back to the report, if members of the community disagree with or do not support what governments are trying to do, wicked problems, health, education, employment will not be solved. Again, I interpolate. You cannot educate people against their will. You cannot get people to work in a job against their will. You cannot do these things by episodic departmental interventions. They can only be dealt with by community localised solution brokering. And this is something that is almost difficult to obtain. To go back to the report, in Central Australia, government is the main provider of an economy, as against having some industries, and particularly mining, which do not of themselves ensure having an economy, as against having an industry. We pointed out in the report that in one of the areas of greatest production of wealth in Australia, the Pilbara in Western Australia, you couldn't get a haircut. You couldn't get your clothes dry cleaned. You couldn't buy a cup of coffee because the cost structure was so completely out of line with having an economy as against an industry. These are the problems that occur across remote Australia. The conclusion of the report is that, and again I quote, "There's a critical need for an ongoing institution that has the mandate and authority to focus on remote Australia, change the dynamic of underdevelopment that afflicts the region, and sustain a momentum for change and regional coordination that is specific to remote Australia, an Outback Commission by any other name." The critical point is that the solution proposed accepts that a separate body is required which is not part of the political contest, operates beyond the political cycle, is the custodian of the shared vision and has the authority to keep everyone honest. On reflection, I think I put that in the Minister's ear last night as well. As yet, no political party has embraced the need for a serious change in the way government itself operates in remote Australia. Instead, there are endless examinations of why programs have not worked and no examination of whether the way government goes about its business in the problem. One of the particulars we threw up in researching this, by the way, was that in one department, I think it was the olfactia, there was something like 260 reports on program and program failure, and not a single report on whether the way we went about the business was perhaps contributing to that failure. I mean, there's a certain lack of intellectual sort of nous in the way these things are dealt with. Now, time permits only brief reference to some more recent reports that support the need for institutional change. Aboriginal people are justifiably sick to death of the system. And the only reason I'm glad I'm not Aboriginal is that I don't think I could be as patient and as tolerant as they are. But the recently released Empowered Communities report, which is principally directed at Indigenous people taking responsibility for their lives and futures, notes that this means all levels of government sharing and in some cases relinquishing certain powers and responsibilities. One part of its detailed proposal is the establishment of an Indigenous Policy Productivity Council. This body has a role in Indigenous affairs similar to the Outback Commission proposed in the Remote Focus report, in that it has statutory independence and can, among other things, keep people honest, keep people accountable and mediate disputes, keep the ring over time, as I would describe it. The already mentioned Pew report makes the point that the Outback needs to be managed as a coherent entity and that management, planning and governance will be effective and cost efficient only when the Outback is recognised as a coherent entity. There is scope and need for far more substantial collaboration across jurisdictions and tenures. Every day, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm sure you will share this view, every day there's a reminder that there is so much to be done, so much needing to be fixed. The size and complexity of the issues can lead to despair. I'm grateful for the guidance I received from Hal Wooten QC when he gave the lecture named in his honour at the University of New South Wales Law School, which he founded. Hal was a president of the Australian Conservation Foundation, a fine lawyer, a judge, Royal Commissioner, Deputy President of the Native Title Tribunal, the man who has the mind I would like to have, to be quite frank, wonderful writer, terrific fellow. And in this lecture he gave, one paragraph explained to me why we should never allow ourselves to be overwhelmed by the enormity of the challenges we face. I quote Hal Wooten in conclusion. Hal said, in 1944, when I was still at an impressionable age, Lord Wavell published an anthology of verses entitled Other Men's Flowers. I too have gained much comfort, insight and help in expressing my thoughts by appropriating other men's flowers. For me, one unwitting florist was Lord Diplock, who remarked that a judge seldom has the opportunity to say, like Lord Mansfield, the air of England is too free for any slave to breathe. Let the black go free. But every now and again there's an opportunity to give a little nudge that sends the law along the direction it ought to go. I believe it is not just judges, but every man and woman who in everything they do can give the world little nudges that in conjunction with all the other little nudges can affect where the world goes. End of quote. Everyone here is in a different way trying to nudge the world of the rangelands into a better place. It's an important role, it's an honourable role. I wish you, and indeed all of us, success in our nudging. Thank you.
Fred, I really enjoyed your address in Houston, Longreach. Are you optimistic for change in this area?
If you're not an optimist, you give up, and that's not appropriate. Yeah, look, I'm always hopeful of change, and I think the forces against the sort of changes I discussed in the remote focus context are very considerable because Australia is a democracy. There's a lot of voting for selfish reasons. We all say we're interested in the nation, but we're interested in ourselves. And so the whole weight of the electoral system runs in favour of where the people are. That's what democracy is about. But I think there are ways of dealing with that, including, of course, the work that you all do and the work that some of the NGOs here do in really drawing attention to the significance of the whole of Australia to Australia. I nearly started my talk here with a couple of poems that I remember from my childhood. poems or songs, I can't remember. I love a sunburnt country, a land of sweeping plains. Breathes through a man with a soul so dead, who never to himself has said, this is my own, my native land. This is my land. I do love the sunburnt country. I think we have to be appealing to the understanding, adding to the understanding of the Australian people that this matters. It matters environmentally, it matters financially, it matters socially, it matters strategically. And so I think we all have to be, messengers in this, and I think we have to be opportunists. That's why I mentioned the royalties for regions. That single bit of opportunism on the part of the National Party in Western Australia was a transformational thing. A transformational thing. So opportunities occur. The interesting thing is, and again to go back to the native title business, Millipum's case was lost here in the Northern Territory. That was the case when the Gove people claimed their native title. And the court, a brilliant judgment by the way, by Justice Blackburn, said no, we can't recognise what you've demonstrated before me. A governance of laws and not of men, a subtle and intricate system. These are the sort of words he used in describing the evidence, but we can't recognise it. The lawyers turned to politics. They thought, well, we won't change this in the High Court, given the current proposition. The judge, the Council for the Aboriginals, the Council for the Commonwealth all said this has to be fixed politically. The opportunity came with the election of the Whitlam government, the Woodward reports. Council for the Commonwealth, by then was a Member of Parliament, a Liberal Member of Parliament, chairing our Aboriginal Affairs Committee, and the Parliament unanimously supported land rights. Fantastic. But very opportunistic. That's why I think there are so many lessons in this for all of us. We then appointed John Toohey, who died last Friday, to be the first Land Commissioner. He bedded in the Land Rights Act here, did all the early cases. The counsel for the Aboriginals in the Woodward commissions had been Jerry Brennan. By the time the land rights movement ran out of political puff because of the racist campaigns of the mining industry of that time and the Liberal Party of that time in the state of Western Australia, which I'm rather ashamed, by the time they gave up on the politics, they went back into the courts. Mabo went back into the courts. Toohey and Brennan were on the High Court. It's a wonderful story. And it's a story of you push in whatever direction you can. You use what influence you can. You use the position you have for the moment. Whether it's law or politics or public agitation, the Aboriginal people demonstrated about land rights endlessly, didn't they, Pat? There's a lot of different things you need to do. So let me finish my answer to your question. Angela, sitting here, my wife, said, get out of politics. I said, why? She said, your answers to questions are too long. So let me finish by saying why I'm an optimist. I grew up in a segregated country, legally, socially, de facto, de jure, segregated. And since 1960, 62 voting rights, 67 the referendum, 76 land rights. Eventually you get polity, then you get Mabo, get the Racial Discrimination Act. I reckon we're getting better. We're getting better. But we've got a long way to go. We only get better if all the people in this room are trying to make it better. Not just for themselves, but for Australia. That's the story. And if we want to make Australia better, we will.
Thanks very much. Fantastic contribution, thanks, Fred. You mentioned one Aboriginal corporation that was functioning effectively. Unfortunately, there are a number of others that aren't quite as effective. I was just wondering what you think the lessons are that can be learned from the one that is functioning effectively that might strengthen those that aren't.
One of the factors as I understand it in KJ, is the devotion of the non-Aboriginal people who work for the corporation. And I know that that alone is not enough, but they, in my view, and one of the reasons why I'm very supportive of them, is because I admire the tremendous personal sacrifice they've made, just as I admire the young women usually who work in some of the remote art centres and do the most amazing work. I mean, you get a terrific young woman living for 7 or 8 years at Warrakurna, for God's sake. I mean, a very isolated place, and yet a wonderful part of that community. So the commitment of non-Aboriginal people to work with Aboriginal people, not as their bosses but as collaborators, is really important. I think you and I have had some exchange on this, but I think but there's not a simple answer. But let me refer to some of the work that I've been doing with the Nunanjara communities in the eastern side of Western Australia, which is a group of about 10 communities which have been self-managing for about the last quarter century. They run stores well, they run the roadhouse, they run the medical service, they've got a lot of runs on the board. And I think, when I think back to how I found them in 1979, divided, disputatious, in awful circumstances, all gathered together in Warburton before they went out to their different separate communities over the ensuing years. I think what they've done is absolutely miraculous, but I also think they're pretty stuck. They've still got, the kids are not getting a good education in the sense that I think they need. There's not enough employment of Aboriginal people there. There's lots of jobs held by non-Aboriginal people. And one of the things that they've done, and I've supported the people that have been trying to bring this about, is to have independent directors. So they've just appointed to this 17-person Aboriginal council, which is deeply traditional in its composition, 2 really high-quality independent directors who are working pro bono, probably putting in a week a month, I would think. It's fantastic what people are prepared to put in. But that's one way where I think the people can be empowered and given assistance to have a vision for their new future, because it has to be a new future. It can't be like the old, can't be like the past. So I think that strong governance is not always best totally as Aboriginal governance. Sometimes it is, and there's an enormous sense of ownership by Aboriginal people, of all Aboriginal boards and so on. I respect that. But I think that, so there are different approaches at different times, but one of the things is that I think there does need to be a very active ORIC that intervenes in cases of wrongdoing, whether it's by the servants of corporations or by the corporations themselves. There is a lot of moral hazard in the operation of many of these corporations, particularly those which have a lot of money. It's very easy for the white servants, the Aboriginal directors, to have pretty cosy relationships. So it's an area of immense difficulty which I think we have to keep working on. And again, the contribution of non-Aboriginal people to this is to be honest friends, advisors of integrity. Aboriginal people with money attract thieves like a piece of rotten meat attracts flies. Thieves love Aboriginal communities. So there's a moral hazard in the sense that some of our best non-Aboriginal people go and work in Aboriginal communities, and I think some of our worst. And when the latter occurs, it's a very difficult problem.
Wal Whaley from UNE Armidale. Thank you, Fred. My area of expertise is a long way from politics and law, and one of the things that you said to me which resonated is that one over time can sometimes give nudges in the right direction. One of the things that has bothered me over many years is how does one tell what is the right direction?
That involves judgments. And let me give you some of my judgments in terms of the community I've tried to work with. I think that my judgment is that it's really important that Aboriginal people get a full education in the majority society as well as in their own society. I think they take their own responsibility for educating people in their own society and culture. Culture is probably a better word. But I think for Aboriginal people to have the future in Australia that I would like to see, that is one of equality, recognition, respect. All the evidence of my lifetime is that Aboriginal people who are able to walk confidently in both cultures are going to be fine. Now, this is a judgment, and some people will differ. You have to decide what you think is right and work towards it. And sometimes you get it wrong, of course. It would be nice to be infallible, but of course none of us can make any claim to that. So I think what you have to do, though, is to be honest in looking at the facts. For example, Aboriginal communities should be closed because they're not viable. Well, in my view, nor is Darwin. I think Darwin lives on the GST collected in my state of Western Australia, actually. A very sore point at the moment. It lives on subventions from the Commonwealth taxpayer. I think Darwin needs to be there. Let me make it plain. We need a major city in the north, and I think it's a fine city. But to say that it is in some... Was the railway line viable? You make decisions not on the basis of some sort of shorthand bloody economic judgment. For economists who know the price of everything and the value of nothing, you know that saying. You have to make judgments, and one of the judgments is we need a major city up there, we pay for it. Okay, I think we need a web of settlement across this country. It's ours. The people who most want to make up that web of settlement are Aboriginal people. And I think we should support that web of settlement, just as we support most of the economy of our modern economy, not through doing the sort of things the Minister talked about, but by having nurses, doctors, service industries. That's where most of us work. A web of service industries across these places, with the Aboriginal people themselves participating. These are judgments I make, mate, and they might be wrong, but I think for as long as I've got breath, I'll keep nudging things in that direction.